Welcome to the History of Sexuality Online. You are going to be reading a chapter in Major Problems this week called The Politics of Reproduction. So this is just meant to make a few observations so that you have some context for the reading. The introduction of the chapter sets the conversations over reproduction in the aftermath of the passage of the Comstock Act, which we talked about. That was passed in 1873. The text includes this piece of information in its introduction. The Comstock Act drastically curbed the birth control available to women. And while some folks found ways around the law, Margaret Sanger is one example of someone from working class background who really sees the need for greater access to birth control. Margaret's own mother had given birth to 11 children, and Margaret blamed her mother's death at the age of 50 on these frequent pregnancies, and so definitely viewed birth control as one way to improve the plight of working class women. She was a nurse, and she saw firsthand a lot of the misery that working class women faced as a result of not having control over their ability to reproduce or not reproduce. So Sanger will point out, particularly in source number 3 that you will have in your text, that she is speaking from personal experience. So she'll mention in her testimony before Congress that her mother's frequent pregnancies contributed to her early death. She will also point out that because of the silence surrounding sexuality, again, this was Anthony Comstock's preferred method in order to control sexuality, she said that women were ignorant about the sex function, so they didn't know how this worked in their own bodies. And she will tie this lack of knowledge to unplanned births. And so the image that you're seeing there is Sanger in front of a birth control clinic that she opened in 1916. The birth control clinic was shut down and she went on trial. And so she's actually, the source number 3 is actually a piece of her testimony before Congress, or not before Congress, but at her trial. So one of the things to note about Sanger is that because of the lack of information around birth control, Sanger, in order to kind of fulfill her crusade to get birth control information to working class women, she actually went to Europe in 1913 to research birth control. And so when she returned to America in 1914, this is when she began to promote birth control in a newspaper she published called The Woman Rebel. The post office declared Sanger's publication to be obscene, again, under the Comstock laws, and they filed charges against her. And so what she did in response is she put together a pamphlet that provided detailed information about birth control methods, and she worked with a labor organization to distribute 100,000 copies of these among working class women, and then she fled to Europe to avoid prosecution for obscenity. She opened the birth control in 1916 once she came back from Europe. And so in 1916, when she opens the birth control clinic, she does so in a working class Jewish and Italian neighborhood. And as the first essay will point out, it's only open for 9 days before police shut it down. But in 9 days, it attracted 464 clients. Now, the other thing to note about Margaret Sanger, and this does come up in source 3, is she will tie birth control not only to the benefits for working class women, but she'll also make some statements about how birth control will be tied to the future welfare of the race. So one of the things that a lot of critics of Margaret Sanger have noted is that she does couch her argument for birth control within the developing eugenics movement, saying that providing birth control to certain kinds of women, the less desirable kinds of women, will actually cut down then on the numbers of births from the less desired, women. And so that's actually better for the race as a whole, the dominant, in her mind, white race. So obviously very problematic kinds of thinking, but again, very common, unfortunately, in the early 20th century. So essay number 1 will note that by the early 20th century, even birth control opponents believed that the practice of birth control was unstoppable, that it was in fact already a common practice, in particular among the prosperous. And so the so-called sexual revolution occurring at the early 20th century, according to this essay, also meant that more and more people were beginning to view sexual activity as discrete from reproduction, that these were two separately justified human activities. And this is obviously a very important development in the history of sexuality, where some people are beginning to divorce sexuality from reproduction. And this is only possible through some kind of birth control. And so the author of the first essay goes on to say, the eventual mass acceptance of this morality required the conviction that sexual indulgence without the risk of pregnancy was a good thing, but also that fear of illegitimacy was not necessary to maintain an acceptable public morality. So Linda Gordon in that first essay will talk about the ways in which birth control is tied to social revolution. So that certainly is a revolutionary way of thinking for the early 20th century. So the image you're seeing there is a depiction of a middle-class woman actually swatting away the stork, which has brought her child. And the caption reads, "And the villain still pursues her." So you can see a popular depiction of even middle-class concerns about access to birth control. The next image that you're seeing is from a publication by Margaret Sanger, Birth Control Review. So it's important to note that even though the judge did not rule in favor of Margaret Sanger's birth control clinic, apparently the judge did include in his ruling a more liberal interpretation of New York state law, allowing physicians for the first time to legally prescribe contraception for general health reasons rather than just for the prevention of venereal disease. So that's an important step toward recognizing birth control's legitimacy, in that you have a judge saying a doctor can certainly prescribe birth control. And this was often the case, that doctors would prescribe birth control to women who are married. According to one source, this ruling, even though, again, it's not in favor of Sanger, became the bedrock for doctor-staffed birth control clinics, an integral part of the birth control movement's goal to afford all women access to birth control. And so even though it's a step back for Margaret Sanger, in some ways it's a step forward for birth control. And so in 1921, Sanger goes on to found the American Birth Control League, and the mission of the Birth Control League was to provide education on the prevention of pregnancy. She serves as its president until 1928, and this organization eventually becomes the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Now, I'm just going to point out, and I will point it out again on the next slide, that Margaret Sanger is not somebody who advocated abortion. You will read that yourselves in the sources that are contained in the textbook. So the other thing to note that is maybe just a footnote in some ways in the textbook is that the best contraceptive from Margaret Sanger's point of view was the vaginal diaphragm, and that does require a private fitting in the early 20th century. And so that's a little depiction from a book Margaret Sanger published, in which she was outlining the pros and cons and different forms of birth control. The other thing to note in this chapter is that we have sources number 5 and then source number 6. Source number 5 gives you guys a firsthand glimpse from women who were writing to Margaret Sanger asking for birth control advice. And what's nice about the selection in your text is that some of these excerpts certainly represent what sounds a little bit more like a working class view. So, for example, one of the letters mentions that she's a woman who already has 6 children. She has a husband with tuberculosis. She's had to send 4 children away to some kind of home because she can't feed them herself. And she writes to Margaret Sanger, and still, my husband wants me to run the risk of having more. There's also a little snippet from somebody that sounds possibly coming from more of a middle class background. There's a woman, for example, who's trying to figure out what to tell her daughter as her daughter approaches marriage. And one of the quotes from that piece is, "My daughter is a sincerely Christian lady, and I sincerely don't want her to go into matrimony as green and unqualified as I am right now." Source number 6 is some statistics from a Baltimore birth control clinic in 1929. And again, what's sort of interesting to note is that the women who were seeking birth control information were on average women who had been already pregnant more than 6 times and who had borne 5 children. That's the average. And the other thing to note in source number 6 is the source will talk about some of the criticisms that most of the people making use of birth control clinics were from the upper classes, and again, the more socially desirable classes. And fortunately or unfortunately, the birth control clinic is responding by saying that 94% of the patients are actually coming from the working classes. And so they are trying to counter these claims that the wrong sorts of women are continuing to reproduce while the right kinds of women are seeking birth control and are contributing to what some folks called race suicide, again, unfortunately. Right, and just to, again, underline the fact that Margaret Sanger herself was not advocating for birth control understood as abortion. In the piece that we have from her in our textbook on page 314, she will talk about how birth control information is a much better alternative to both celibacy as well as abortion, which she claims is, quote, a disgrace to a civilized community. And this, as far as I know, is her position for the bulk of her lifetime. Even when we move into the 1960s and we begin to see the development of the pill, she's advocating for the pill over the legalization of birth control. So we've mentioned just a little bit these concerns that are swirling around the wrong sorts of people reproducing versus the right sorts of people reproducing. Somebody who was concerned about race suicide and the wrong sorts of people outnumbering the right sorts of people, and again, how do we even begin to talk about that, was Teddy Roosevelt. And so this is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt in which he says, "Woman must be the housewife, the helpmeet of the homemaker, the wise and fearless mother of many healthy children. When women fear motherhood, they tremble on the brink of doom. And well it is they should vanish from the earth, where they are fit subjects for the scorn of all men and women who are themselves strong and brave and high-minded." So Teddy Roosevelt believed in having a vigorous race. He envisioned that in the racialized terms that were prevailing in his day, and he thought that middle and upper class women were doing a disservice to the entire nation when they weren't reproducing and allowing the less fit to reproduce. One side note is the impact of World War I on the birth control movement. According to one source, the birth control movement received an unexpected boost during World War I because it turned out that as U.S. men went off to training camps and then fought overseas, many of the U.S. military soldiers were diagnosed with venereal diseases. And so in order to combat the venereal diseases that were springing up in the military in the context of World War I, the military undertook an extensive education campaign, which mostly focused on abstinence, and in this way they were very different from what the Europeans were doing. But they did also offer some contraceptive guidance. And so the images you're seeing there are some of the propaganda that was aimed at these young men who were, I guess, in some ways, men adrift in training camps away from the watchful eyes of friends, family, and neighbors. And so will you be a free man or chained to venereal disease or the enslaving habit, again, of masturbation? And then we've got the other image there saying only a poor boob pays his money, loses his watch, gets the sif. There you go. There's your reference to venereal disease and brags that he's had a good time. So keep your money, don't see prostitutes, and, be smart in terms of keeping your sexual health. One of the things to note is that the U.S. military does not distribute condoms. It does not endorse their use, making the U.S. the only military force in World War I that did not supply condoms to its troops. But when U.S. soldiers were in Europe, they found condoms readily available, and at least according to one source, when they returned to the United States, many continued to use condoms as their preferred method of birth control. So that's another development spurring the legalization of birth control, even though it's also still very regulated. The other topic that will come up in the reading is the passage of legislation in 1921, and this is the Shepard-Towner Act. This is coming on the heels of women getting the right to vote in 1920 nationally. The Shepard-Towner Act is mentioned in the second article. This is the Ladd-Taylor article. And as she will note in her discussion of the program, the act provided about $1.25 million to establish things like well baby clinics, educational programs, visiting nurse projects, and this was all with the goal of reducing infant and maternal mortality. And so one of the things that got funded as part of this legislation is shown on the slide there. And this is these health mobiles that could go into even more rural parts of states in order to help rural women get access to medical care that was not readily available. Advocates who were working with the Shepard-Towner Act saw themselves, again, as part of the eugenics movement, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But again, it's this idea that we want to promote better babies among the better classes, and so they are trying to make sure that happens. But one of the things that Ladd-Taylor will point out is that the campaign ended up challenging eugenic ideas, in part because there was this underlying assumption that with some education of parents, with some environmental reform, that these kinds of things could actually overcome minor genetic deficiencies. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. The legislation runs out of funding by the late 1920s, and Congress decides not to renew its funding after 1929. So that's a bit of a setback. Okay, so that was just my phone blinging. That's always fun when that happens. So let's talk a little bit about the eugenics movement. So the eugenics movement is a quasi-science, it claimed to be a science, which linked social problems such as poverty, criminality, etc., to inferior genetic material. So there's this idea that human inequalities were linked to hereditary factors, and that certain races and even certain kinds of people had more defective traits compared to other races and other kinds of people. And so this is this idea that desirable human characteristics were spread unevenly through the races and society. And so in order to improve society, we would want to encourage, again, the so-called better races to breed, and that will benefit everybody as a whole. So the solution then for social problems, one solution in addition to selective breeding, was to then prevent the unfit from producing more children. So that's awesome. Actually, it's not awesome. I'm being sarcastic there. So what you're seeing on the slide in terms of the image is a illustration from one of these eugenicist books. So it's tracing the descendants of a man named Martin Kallikak. And you can see that on the left, this is what happens when you dally with a tavern girl. So she would be considered somebody who is a less choice member of society. And through that alliance, he produces all of these terrible children who are a burden on society. And then on the right, he marries the wealthy Quakeress, and they, of course, produce these 6 fine children who go on to produce fine children. So again, the key being make sure that the tavern girls and their offspring either don't exist or are prevented from producing more children. And this is the idea that we can improve society through selective breeding and the sterilization of the unfit. One of the things that comes into play is kind of how do you decide who is unfit? And one of these sort of nebulous characteristics is this idea of feeble-mindedness. And feeble-mindedness was established through a series of tests that were administered. This is the era in the aftermath, especially of World War I, where we're administering IQ tests. And so there was this idea that certain kinds of tests could be administered, especially to people who were incarcerated, and these tests would help us to determine that folks were feeble-minded, didn't have the intelligence of the general population, and that then, of course, would be the definition that would lead to arguments for state sterilization. And so we do see the passage of state sterilization laws in the early 20th century. And it's interesting to note, I have this in my notes, that one member of the Eugenics Record Office actually testified before Congress in 1920 that in addition to the tavern girls who were weakening the entire race, the American gene pool was being polluted by a rising tide of intellectually and morally defective immigrants, particularly those from Eastern and Southern Europe. So you also begin to see some eugenics ideology playing into calls for immigration restrictions. The next image just shows, again, some of the propaganda by eugenics supporters. So they would distribute signs to poor men, and the idea being these men maybe, because they were not native English speakers or maybe just were illiterate, they couldn't read what was on the sign. So I cannot read this sign. By what right have I children? This again is just supposed to help illustrate the point for the advocates of eugenics. This next image shows the widespread nature of states who had sterilization laws in place. This is an image from 1930, I think it's 35. And so all of the states with the shade have state sterilization laws, and then the ones in black are the ones who are in the process of passing those. If you can read the numbers, those also tell you how many people had been sterilized in those states by 1933. Historians point out that California and Virginia were two of the states with the highest numbers of sterilization. And in Virginia, and possibly in California, although I honestly don't know this, people who were racial minorities were often disproportionately sterilized. Now, what also I think is pretty fascinating, I realize I'm kind of getting long-winded here, is that these state sterilization laws were contested in some cases, and one case actually went to the Supreme Court, and this is the 1925 case of Buck versus Bell. So the story behind it is that Carrie Buck, who is pictured there on the left, she was an illegitimate child herself, and she was raped, became pregnant, and she ended up being sent to a state institution for the feeble-minded, and this was in Virginia. She was labeled feeble-minded because of her performance on intelligence tests. Her mother was also given an intelligence test, and she also was found to be feeble-minded. And then she was also deemed feeble-minded in part because of her questionable morals. She had, after all, born an illegitimate child. So Carrie Buck was sterilized, and she protests her sterilization. And the other thing that the text will mention, and I don't know if some of you will realize this, but one of the pieces that you'll read is that in some cases people were sterilized against their will and against their knowledge. And so some of you might be wondering how that happened, and what would happen is people who were in these homes for the feeble-minded might be told that they needed an operation for an appendectomy, for example, but then it turned out that there wouldn't be an appendectomy performed, it would be a sterilization procedure. So Carrie Buck protested her sterilization. The Supreme Court hears the case. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the state and not in favor of Carrie Buck. And this is just a little excerpt from the Supreme Court's decision in that case from Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives," and that's a reference, of course, to World War I and wartime in general when we have the draft. He goes on to say it would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, again, because the thinking is that unworthy people will produce unworthy children, it is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. And then in specific reference to Carrie Buck, 3 generations, noting her mother, her, and then her daughter, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And the image that you see there is the sort of family tree of Carrie Buck, showing that she has got the F for feeble-minded. She is the product of a feeble-minded woman, and she's given birth to a feeble-minded child. So lots to take in there with that. A lot to read in the text. One of the other things to note, too, is that Molly Ladd Taylor, who will talk about eugenics, will say that, in fact, for some women, sterilization was not unwanted. So there's that complicating piece as well. But lot to process. So good luck with that.